Before we get started, I would appreciate if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you. Okay, so now I want to show you that ISO 20022 is about messaging in relation to correspondent banks by going through some of the websites and documents that I've gathered this information from. Just to show you that I'm not just speaking of my own accord here, but I'm actually speaking based upon what they are actually telling us. That's what I'm telling you. So here we have what is ISO 20022 and how is it changing in November 2022. ISO 20022 and cross-border payments. The ISO 20022 standard will change the way banks relay cross-border payment instructions. Some banks are already prepared, while others have a lesser degree of readiness. All banks need to be fully equipped to receive, process, and exchange the full ISO 20022 information from one party to the next. A break in the chain could mean the potential loss of vital information. So here you can clearly see that ISO 20022 is about messaging. It's to do with the messaging layer that's going to be upgraded in the banking infrastructure, not the settlement layer, the messaging layer. And it's talking about vital information being exchanged between one bank to another as part of cross-border payment instructions. And then it goes into talk about ISO 20022 and high-value payments, and it gives a diagram of a picture of all the high-value payment systems around the world. So this light blue here, it says the live migration date, delivered migration. So if you look at countries like China, as I've already mentioned in my previous video, China it has a HVPs system, which is the RTGS system, as I've stated before. So China's RTGS system is called CNAPS, and in 2015, their RTGS system CIPS became live with ISO 20022. That's one country, and then you have India as well. So India became live with ISO 20022 for their RTGS system NG-RTGS in 2013, and this clearly shows that RTGS has been live for a very long time. It's not coming live in November, and high value payments has been live with RTGS for a very long time as well. It's not something that's becoming live in November. And then you have the Eurozone. So the Eurozone is planned migration, and that's what we know. We know in the Eurozone, November 2021, this is old. That was the original planned migration date, but then it was delayed and postponed because SWIFT was delaying and postponing their migration time to November 2022. So Target 2 in the Eurozone, which is their RTGS system, which is going to be upgraded to T2, so it's going to be called T2, coming November 2022, is going live with ISO 20022 in November. That's the planned migration. So all this is planned migration in the Eurozone. And then you have the yellow, which is future migration. So you have this country here, I think it's Russia, and that's got a future migration date. Let's see if I can find it. It says here the Russian Federation, their RTGS system is in 2023, and you have countries like Canada, they've got a future migration date, and so on. So RTGS HVPs has been around for time. It's not going live in November. The only thing that's going live in November is ISO 20022, and ISO 20022 has nothing to do with the RTGS settlement system. It's to do with the messaging layer of banks. Okay, so let's go to the next site. The industry challenge towards ISO 20022 as a global payments standard. Consensus is being reached. Implementation requires extensive coordination. So here it gives a case of the NIBC bank coordinating ISO 20022 compliancy as an example of some of the challenges that banks are facing with migrating over to the ISO 20022 messaging standard. So what does it say here? Above challenges apply to all individual participants in the network, namely the banks that exchange payment instructions through correspondent banking method. So why are they mentioning that there's challenges with ISO 20022 migration to all individual participants in the network, namely the banks that exchange payment instructions through correspondent banking method? Because the RTGS system for cross-border payments are still going to be done by correspondent banking. ISO 20022 is just for the messaging layer between these banks. So NIBC Bank is an interesting example of a bank facing ISO 20022 migration. NIBC is a publicly listed mid-tier enterprise bank offering products and services in northwestern Europe from its head office in The Hague, as well as offices in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, London, and Brussels. So NIBC interacts with correspondent banks directly and has connectivity to the system target 2. Exactly what I was telling you guys and showing you guys in my previous videos with some of the diagrams, how correspondent banking works and how this system for settlement is going to use correspondent banking, and how the RTGS system in the case of Europe target 2 is going to use correspondent banking for settlement. It's not going to use XRP in November. It's not going to utilize XRP or a DLT based RTGS payments system like Ripple, as people are saying in the XRP community. They are clearly telling you here that it's going to be still using correspondent banking, which they already have the infrastructure for, which they already have the correspondent banks all there. Because remember, prior to ISO 20022, they are using correspondent banking with the MT messaging standard. So the only thing that's going to happen when ISO 20022 goes live, known as the MX standard, is that the banks are just going to use the MX standard. It's going to be a change from MT to MX, whereas that's all in the messaging layer. When it comes to the RTG, the settlement layer is still going to be via the same route of correspondent banking to process payments cross borders. So the NIBC interacts with correspondent banks directly and has connectivity to the system target 2. So the NIBC basically is a bank that is a direct participant of the target 2 RTGS system. So it has a direct account with the Central Bank of Europe, so it can benefit from target 2. And as a result, it also interacts with correspondent banks. So it also interacts with correspondent banks, and it's able to process payments for these correspondent banks, because remember, these banks don't have a direct connectivity to the target 2 system, so they use NIBC instead. So it's able to process payments for the correspondent banks via target 2, and all these payments could be cross-border, and they do it again through correspondent banking, as they're telling you here. So these non-SEPA payment message flows are currently performed using MT messages and will have to be transformed into ISO 20022 standard. Exactly what I'm saying, guys. Exactly what I'm saying. And this is and this is what I'm trying to tell people, that the only thing that is changing is the messaging standard from MT to MX. Everything else is going to stay the same in November. They're still going to use correspondent banks. They're not transitioning over to XRP. So different implementation timelines by correspondence. So this is a challenge. One of the difficulties that they're having is that correspondent banks as well, they're going to have to implement ISO 20022, and different banks have different migration times. So these are challenges and difficulties that they're facing within the market. So each bank engaging in correspondent banking can independently define their own implementation time. So every bank can choose in the correspondence banking space when they want to migrate over. NIBC interacts with multiple correspondent banks as well as the Euro settlement platform target 2. So this NIBC bank interacts with correspondent banks and is also a direct participant of the target 2 system. Implementation timelines differ between these parties. Target 2 will perform a big bang approach. So November 2022, Target 2 is going to be ISO 20022 compliant. That means all the banks that are connected to Target 2, like the NIBC bank, would have to be ISO 20022 compliant. However, the correspondent banks, the banks that are indirectly connected to the target system, they may not necessarily migrate to ISO 20022 in November, but then they have a time frame. They can migrate in their own time, so long as it's between 2022 to 2025. But then that's their time frame. And that's a challenge because different implementation timelines by correspondent banks. So the system will require all its participants to change their message formats on a single day, like the NIBC bank. But this is not the case for correspondent banks. So then what does that mean? There's going to be a problem here where correspondent banks are going to be using the MT messaging standard, whereas banks that are connected to Target 2, they're going to have to use the MX messaging standard. So that's a challenge that they're going to have with each other because two different standards are going to be used. And I'm going to talk more about this in this video. So in contrast, correspondent banks will adapt to the ISO 20022 format over a gradual 3-year period of time. Exactly what I'm saying. That correspondent banks are not necessarily going to migrate to ISO 20022 in November. They're going to do it over a gradual 3-year period of time. So they've got time to do it. Whereas any bank that's going to be a direct participant of the Target 2 RTGS system in the Eurozone has to go ISO 20022 in November. And again, it's just the messaging layer. The RTGS system is still going to be using correspondent banking to settle cross-border payments. It's not going to be using XRP. So I'm just going to show you document after document here where I'm not making this stuff up, and this is what they're telling us. So what is CBR Plus? So CBR Plus is Swift's program for adopting ISO 20022 for cross-border payments and reporting messages in the correspondent banking space. That's what CBR Plus is about. It's a program by Swift to help in the adoption of ISO 20022 for cross-border payments in the correspondent banking space. The use of ISO 20022 messages in Swift cross-border payments will start in November 2022. So Swift is migrating over to ISO 20022 in November 2022 alongside the Eurozone's RTGS system target. So with a coexistence phase up to November 2025, where old MT messages for cross-border payments and cash reporting will be replaced. So Swift is coming up with a solution for the problems that correspondent banks are going to be having, because correspondent banks are not necessarily going to be migrating over in 2022. So what Swift is going to be doing is, because the Eurozone is migrating in 2022 and all the direct banks that are connected to the Eurozone's RTGS system is going to be migrating in November 2022, all the other correspondent banks that are still going to be using the old MT messages for cross-border payments, Swift is going to come up with a solution to help these banks. And that's what Swift is going to be doing. So I'm going to discuss more on this in this video, but look, let's check this out. What Swift MT messages are in scope for the ISO 20022 migration. So as you can see, the following MT messages will be migrated to ISO 20022 messages starting November 2022. So as you can see, it's all to do with the messaging layer, not the settlement layer. The MT, all these messages are going to be converted over to these ISO 20022 formats, the MT formats, PAC, CAMT. Again, nothing to do with the RTGS system being changed or correspondent banking system being changed, just the messaging layer. So RTGS for high value payments, minimizing risk with HVP settlements. So let's scroll down here. Oh, this is a nice chart. In this chart, it tells you that the total of RTGS systems and total of countries using RTGS systems, and it starts from 1981, it's at 0, and as you can see in 1990 there's a little increase in countries using it, and in 1996 countries are using it, and then the total number of systems of RTGS systems increases, and as well as in the countries that are using it until today. So people are saying this is it's going to go live in 2022 when it's been around since 1981. Come on, guys. This is ridiculous now. So here's this diagram as well. And in this diagram, the image source is from Swift white paper. It shows you the RTGS system. Let's pretend this is the Eurozone. This is the Target 2 RTGS system, the high value payment system, the large value payment system. The RTGS system is there to process these high value, large value payments. And it's going live in the Eurozone for ISO 20022 compliancy. The system itself is not going live, just the messaging standard ISO 20022 for the Central Bank of Europe for the RTGS system is going live. Now, what that means is that all these connecting banks, let's pretend all these four things, all these institutions our banks have to go live for ISO 20022 in the Eurozone as well in November 2022. However, the correspondent banks, these are the cross-border correspondent banks that don't have this indirect participant, this participant here, this bank here, this bank here is in another country. It doesn't have a direct connection to the Eurozone's RTGS system, so they don't have to go live in November in 2022. They can choose when they want to go live between November 2022 to November 2025. But now there's a problem, because these banks here are going to be using the MX ISO standard, whereas the participants banks, the indirect participants, they could be using their old MT standard. And this is how cross-border payments are going to be settled via these banks with RTGS, and it's known as correspondent banking. But then as there's going to be a different messages between the two, there needs to be a solution, and SWIFT is going to provide that solution, as I will show you in this video. But again, it's nothing to do with the change of correspondent banking. Let's just say that's the settlement layer. It's to do with the change of the messaging layer. You have to differentiate the two. You can't keep conflating the messaging layer and the settlement layer together. And this is a good example, and this is a good illustration of correspondent banks in line with the RTGS system and direct participants. Now think about it, yeah? This diagram would be useless if they're going to be utilizing XRP in November. Why would they show us indirect participants and participants from another, basically more indirect participants? Why would they show us correspondent banking if they're going to be using XRP? If they're going to be using XRP, then XRP would get rid of correspondent bankings, because XRP would have direct connections between banks. So this RTGS system in Europe and the bank abroad in another country would have a direct connection via XRP, via the XRP ledger, Ripple. So they won't need correspondent banking. So why are they showing us this diagram, and why are they mentioning correspondent banking still, if in November 2022 they plan to use XRP for the settlement of high value payments? This diagram is completely irrelevant. The fact that they're still showing us this sort of structure is because they do not plan to use XRP in November. They don't. And they're telling us they still plan to use correspondent banks, and this is what this diagram shows. And again, it's from the SWIFT white paper. So here it says SWIFT's ISO 20022 services for cross-border payments ready for customer testing with launch of Inflow translation. And that's going to be their solution. SWIFT is going to have an Inflow translation service, their Inflow translation service, and that's going to be how they handle the problem of two different messaging standards, because November 2022, the Eurozone is going to be using the MX messaging standard. The correspondent banks may be still using the MT standard because they don't have to migrate over straight away. So what is going to be the solution between these two different messaging standards? There's going to be an Inflow translation. And for cross-border payments, that SWIFT is preparing a service for cross-border payments. It's going to be ready for customer testing with launch of Inflow translation. There's going to be an Inflow translation for the messaging layer between the two different messaging formats. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so as to not miss my next video. Take care and goodbye.